Hello, I want to go over the basics of spreads, basics of layouts. Um, there are self imposed rules, and then there are rules that are very rigid, and then there are rules that are more suggestions. So, the first and maybe most important thing to understand is hierarchy. Where is our attention drawn? It could be on a headline, it could be on a graphic, it could be on a photo. There's lots of things that determine hierarchy: how big something is, how colorful, how bright or dark. On hair is probably the first thing I see here, followed by this very large image. This is a very, very simple version where we can determine this is actually pretty balanced between there. But here, the first thing you're going to see is this massive photograph followed by other content. This actually doesn't look like a finished spread, but what's most important? Do you love your headline? Make that the biggest, most dominant thing. Do you really love a photograph? Make it big. Make other graphic elements leading to it. If we look at some of the somewhat in progress stuff we've been doing on Yearbook, the most dominant thing on this spread is this photo right here. It's the biggest. Then we follow down to, this main story or this main piece of content. It's been made darker, some of the biggest caption or some of the biggest headline. It's got a graphic element to it. And then we start to see some other elements. Some of the least significant things would be these they're not random quotes, but they're not necessarily directly tied into the spread itself, just to get more names in there. Boy Scouts Country, this photo, it's got, I don't know, like 8 Westfield boys in it. That's a dominant photo. That's the first thing you look at. Then you maybe move along to these other things. So establishing that is key. The thing about Yearbook is we've got so much content to fit in that we don't have the option of varying sizes nearly as much. But when you have simply a couple photos and a single story, you can play around with tying photos and headlines in different ways. But you do want to make it so that it's kind of like a 1, 2, 3. I see this first, followed by this, then I get to the content. You don't want to have it unclear where my attention should be drawn first. Establishing that isn't really important. And part of what helps with establishing like 1, 2, 3, those separate things, is what's called basically modules. There's so many variations on that, but we would probably say that in this case, the headline and subheadline is kind of in its own little box, if you can imagine that. Then we have a photo in its own kind of box. Obviously, it's by default a box. But then our copies in it's separate. So having these things spaced, they don't have to be like spaced out. There needs to be a connection between them, a flow between them. But here again, we see a nice example of how things look kind of like separate links. It's not just one big mass. Let's see what we get when we turn all caps off for starters. We get a lot more yearbooky stuff. That's because Yearbook has to get so much stuff on a spread. It becomes quite important that individual things get blocked off because they're covering slightly different topics within a certain field, but you do want it kind of separated in that way. You're gonna have options. What you're gonna have, like with only one major headline and just a few photos, you're gonna be able to either group or separate things as you see fit. And again, the purpose of modules is to make that hierarchy a little bit more step by step. Another important term that we'll want to try and consider is you've got 2 pages, but they need to be connected. And the way you want to do that is kind of 2 ways. One is called an eye line. It's where there's this space, a line can be an element, or it can be just a space between modules that crosses over the center portion of the spread. It helps link everything together, and treats it as a singular spread, because no one's going to look, well, I mean, it's conceivable that they would look at one page and fold back the other. Now, they generally are going to open it up and look at it as a whole. And another way to do that, we see it on almost all of these, is having some visual element cross that center line as well, whether it be a photo, graphic element, both in this case. That's going to help tie those in, help lead the viewer from one spot to another. There are some just technical things as well that we need to be aware of. Let's go through those terms we need to know. And these are important terms for, one, you understanding so you meet the requirements and you don't forget something. And two, in our discussion and our critique, we want to be able to communicate clearly here. So one is our folio. That's F-O-L-I-O. That has the page number, but also what the spread is. In your case, since you're doing just one spread, I would say make it just page 1, 2. I don't see why it really matters. I wouldn't do anything crazy there. On this side it says designed by the designer that designed it. On this side it says the content. So I would continue that. On the left side, say what this spread is about, just in a brief summary. And on the right side, you'll want to say somewhere who designed it, which is you. Folio, bleed. Okay, so when this goes off to the printer to have it printed, it's going to come out in big stacks. And then there's this big blade that comes down and cuts things pretty accurately. Not always. So anything that you want to go off the page, like this blue bar is supposed to go off the page, have it go off the page, because the big cutting metal bar is going to come down anywhere in between here. That's what the publisher would say. We're going to shoot for this edge right here, but no promises. In fact, it might go over this way a little bit, but it actually could go over this way a little bit, which brings us to this dotted line. This dotted line is the margin. Don't put anything in the margin that would be catastrophic if it got cut off. That this right here wouldn't be the worst thing. If I had text or a headline, that would be a problem if the blade came down right here and cut it off. So that margin is the space that's supposed to be saved, but don't put anything important in there. Finally, another important term is right here, this middle line right here. Think about it. This is a magazine or a book. That's going to be the crease. And depending on how the book or the magazine is bound, it's going to be pretty substantial. So I had said, it's great to have things cross, but don't put anything important. This, who was that, in the Noblesville cross country? I don't know. He's not important. I don't really care about losing him. But I don't want to have, in this space in the middle here, a Westfield student for sure, or anyone important that we'd want to be able to see in the book, or any other text or anything that you're going to need to be able to easily see. There are other terms that aren't necessarily what we're going to use. We have a bunch of columns here. You can set up your document for that, but I don't think that's how we're going to end up setting up our document, because we're going to want quite a bit more flexibility with content. The way columns were being used is just a visual organization tool to help our modules stay a consistent and repeated size, but like I said, I'm not particularly worried about it. All right, that should be all for the technical basics of layout.